we really can't be looking at the vote casting. And a lot of Democratic messaging has been on that. We have to focus on the vote counting and how corruptible it will be with the passage of these bills, how partisan and potentially rigged it will be. The problem is that they have allowed this process to be completely partisan and corruptible. And we might have looked at our last free and fair election as a result.
That was the quote of our broadcast last night, put a lump in a lot of throats, from a woman not given normally to hyperbole. Our guests, Jason Johnson and Matthew Dowd, remain with us. And Matthew, truth be told, my question to A.B. Stoddard last night was motivated by the conversation you had with Nicole Wallace on the air yesterday afternoon. You told the folks watching that we'd left suppression weeks ago, that now this is about vote nullification in our country. And please explain to the folks watching tonight what you said.
So my point, thank you, Brian. My point is that, yes, all of these restrictions and impediments that are being put in place are awful. But you can actually overcome many of them through just sheer energy and sheer force of voters turning out and voting and doing all of that. But what is more deleterious and what is more dangerous to our democracy is the idea that instead of just moving on and trying to take polling places away from people and changing hours of voting and taking away absentee ballots and ballots by mail, we're now going to a thing that even if millions of people show up to defeat Republicans, which I am advocating Americans do in the coming elections overwhelmingly, even if they show up and win, there now is laws being written to allow partisans to be involved in the actual process of the balloting, process of the counting, process of the voting. And then there are laws being written to criminalize and to be able to allow judges in certain jurisdictions to overthrow votes. And there's state legislators to throw out entire campaigns and throw out entire election results and install who they want in place. That's actually, I mean, as bad as voters' restrictions are, that fundamentally changes the nature of this country from a democracy to an autocracy. And that's, I think, the biggest fear and the biggest fight. We spent too much time talking about not being able to give people water in line, which is obviously bad and sort of completely morally corrupt. But we're now really should be debating the idea that we're no longer going to have free and fair elections.
Wow, Jason Johnson, we ought to, Mike Quick here, pivot to solutions. What can you tell the folks watching about remedies, about what could pass the current Congress as we know them?
So this is the sandwich. You're going to have to put two things together. You have to have this watered-down version of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which more or less creates preclearance, which means that when states want to change things about voting, when you have things like Wisconsin where you go from 180 polling stations to 5, it would mean that you would have to get justification for that. You would have to move that through the Justice Department, although it's weakened in the current John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Then you have the For the People Act, which would go back and make illegal and set a basic threshold for voting throughout the country. The passage of both of these bills is necessary. But I have to say this about this commentary about voting or access to voting or anything else like that. These laws are all terrible. We've known they're always terrible. To say, well, we're focusing too much on the voting access and not much on the voting counting. It's like saying, you know, the bad thing about crack, you're a crack addict and it ruins your teeth. Guess what? Crack is bad. These laws are bad, which is why the focus on Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin and Joe Biden and everyone else in the Senate is so critically important. The Democrats do not have much time to pass the two necessary bills to prevent this from happening. Pass these bills, none of these laws are an issue, and then you don't have to worry about water in line or who's counting at the end.
And Matthew, if I understand your point has always been you can throw roadblocks in front of voters. A motivated voter is going to find that further motivation to go to the poll and carry out their democratic duty. But once that vote is cast, if you're going to start screwing around with the numbers backstage, if you're going to have the ability to toss out the will of the voters, that is where you draw a distinction. Am I correct?
Well, and I agree completely with what you just said and what Jason said. It's all bad, But when we get to the point, as you say, where basically people show up and struggle and do all they can to vote, and then their vote isn't counted, that's an entirely different level of autocracy that we've arrived at. And that's where Republicans want the country to head.
Jason Johnson, back to you. The Texas Democrats came to the Hill this week. They have some commiserating to do with Democrats in the U.S. Senate, and that's the math that stares them in the face every day they wake up. What do you tell people who get down when they realize the math in Texas, where Matthew lives, the math in Washington, where Senator Schumer is trying to herd all these cats?
I talked to Reverend Barber last weekend. I talked to Stacey Abrams today. I talked to people who are in the field, and they say that the calls and the attention and all of this focus, the kinds of things that the Texas Democrats are doing by going to Washington, are the only solution that we have. Pressure has to be put on all of the Democratic Party and the Republicans. Remember, they are still representing constituents to make the kind of changes that people want in voting laws. But I have to say this. The fact that Sinema and Manchin, they sent staffers, but didn't even show up to this meeting with Democrats from Texas is indicative of the arrogance of these elected officials, that they won't even meet with members of their own party who are saying, hey, look, we're starving, we're drowning out here. Can you throw us a lifeline?
Gentlemen, thank you both so much. We'll obviously do this again. These are weighty and, to be honest, completely depressing topics, but cover them we must. Jason Johnson, Matthew Dowd, greatly appreciate you staying up with us.